So one of the questions with freelance medical writing and the types of clients is, where do you start? So I just wanted to take a real high level view, quickly to talk about the types of writing in the field, because that will kind of drive the boat on who the clients will be and who the clients are that you're going to be working with. The medical writing field is basically bifurcated into these two big markets, like two big buckets: regulatory writing and then medical communications, which is like everything else. Many writers choose to do one or the other, but there is crossover. You don't have to choose one or the other. But whichever you do, you're going to be working at the intersection of medicine, research, and writing. Okay, so just real briefly, what is regulatory writing? So regulatory writing needs medical writers to help create documents to support a variety of different activities. It might be developing small molecule drugs, it might be developing biologics, getting approval for medical devices, recruiting patients for clinical trials, or supporting the advancement of those trials. There are just a plethora of documents that support all of those things. The audience for these types of documents, of course, is regulatory reviewers, with the goal of getting that biologics license application approved, getting the clinical trial approved, and that sort of thing. So it's a different audience than the Medcomms side of things. It's a little bit more formulaic as well, but for people who really like to interpret data, this is a great place to be. And if you're very interested in, of course, the drug development process and clinical trials, it's a really fun space to be in. Then the Medcomms area, this is where I have a deeper level of experience. Freelancers and Medcomms get involved with a lot of different documents and a lot of different spaces. I personally think it's a little bit more creative space to be, but you can work with patient and clinician education materials, pharma and sales training, the manuscripts, editorials, and abstracts, and conference posters and visual presentations. So just to talk about a little bit about each of these, I've done most of these things, not all. I work a lot with continuing medical education. So for example, I write the technical part of grants to help get funding for an educational activity for a CME company. So for that, for example, if there's a new drug that's been approved, it's this combination of identifying the gaps in the clinic. What does the doctor need to know about this new drug so that it can be incorporated into clinical workflow? Or if there's now combination regimens and therapies that are being advised in the guidelines, what do doctors need to know about adverse reactions and how to manage them or mitigate or monitor for them? So what I like about this kind of work is that you get to get really technical with some of the drug information, but it's also very persuasive writing, because you have to persuade the funder why they should fund that activity for the clinicians. But it's very technical type of writing. In opposition to that is the patient education materials that I do. That's a very different type of writing. For the patient education materials, it's writing for lay audiences, people with low numeracy, for example, low health literacy. You have to find different ways to say things. Think about graphics or simplified terms to get, complicated concepts across. And I like doing both of those types of work because I get to use different sides of my brain and think about the language very differently. I haven't done pharma and sales training yet, but with this type of client, the writer is working on documents that are used to train pharmaceutical sales reps, so that when they go and talk to a doctor or a hospital about the products that they're selling, they can be well informed and they can know about the mechanism of action. They can know about, maybe the side effects, adverse reactions, and this sort of thing, and talk at a very detailed level about the products, while also, of course, layering in their sales. Manuscripts, editorials, and abstracts. This is more working with journals, getting things published. It might be working with academic authors. It might be working with contract research organizations or other types of groups that are trying to get stuff published for pharmaceutical companies sometimes. I've done editing in this area, but not as much writing. And then the conference posters and visual presentations is also a really fun space to be if you like graphics. The visual presentations, I also do with the continuing medical education work, but I've also worked on, for example, slide decks for venture capitalists, an audience of venture capitalists, to try to get funding for diagnostic devices that biotech companies wanted to develop. So as you can see, it's really varied. There's a lot of opportunity in this space and pretty different than the regulatory writing. So what does this mean in terms of client types? We talked a little bit about these different kinds of writing, but like, who are you doing this writing for as a freelancer? So there's a wide variety of clients out there. I feel like every time I try to put my marketing cap on and think about like who to market to, it's just there's a lot of opportunities out there. Publication management is a specialty area. I haven't worked in this before, but I do know some freelancers who have. It's about planning publications, promoting publications. This might be journal articles, for example, but it might also be folios for hospitals, from pharmaceutical companies to promote different things. Distribution of materials. It could be writing the academic articles or trade magazine articles. You think about professional societies, for example, and their newsletters, or maybe they have something that goes out quarterly or annually or monthly. It means working on design sometimes, working with graphic designers. But because publications have so many different steps in terms of not just writing the content, but layout and thinking about strategic distribution and publication, there's also a lot of space in here for project management. And we have a little note at the bottom about the Good Publications Practices Guidelines for Sponsored Medical Research, which is a good document to look up if you want to work in this space, just to learn more about the ethics and professional standards. And Medcomms agencies. This is a great place to start if you're interested in freelance, because you get a wide variety of projects coming through the door with Medcomms agencies. Some Medcomms agencies focus, they follow that kind of bifurcation I talk about at the beginning, with they either do regulatory or the everything else. I've only worked for the Medcomms that do the everything else. I've worked on, in 4 years, maybe I think one project that was actually going to the FDA for review, but that might be just the client mix that I had. Some of them do the publications planning and support. Some of them do continuing medical education. That's actually how I broke into the continuing medical education space, was getting projects from Medcomms agencies. Advisory board support. This is an interesting space. Advisory boards meet and they have these discussions and they want to disseminate the information to stakeholders. So those meeting notes can get distilled down into reports that are then need to be polished and synthesized for distribution to stakeholders and others. Strategic content development, there's a wide variety of things that go into that bucket. So for example, I've been asked to work on competitive analyses where pharma companies are interested to know, like, we've got our drug and our competitor has their drug. We want you to look at the ad campaigns and figure out where the gaps are. What can we be doing differently? So that sort of thing. And then of course the scientific, I see a typo, scientific communication, there should be an I in there. Medical marketing is also a really fun space. Oftentimes these materials are going for medical legal reviews, so they have to be really well documented. It's a lot of documentation, but I've learned to think very differently and deeply on these projects when I do the research. They can be a lot of fun. So the one trade-off with Medcomms agencies, for freelancers, they're great because they send you work, but sometimes there are very short turnaround times. So I've had to learn to talk to my clients about boundaries. Sometimes I've had people calling when I'm trying to make dinner for my kids, wanting something, edited right away. And we have to work out like when I'm taking calls and when I can turn something around. But usually with good communication, I have found most clients are very reasonable, especially if you talk about some of those boundaries in advance. Contract research organizations. I don't have experience in this personally, but I know a little bit about them. So it's almost exclusively regulatory writing. Writers who work in this space will be working on drafting or editing or reviewing study protocols, investigators' brochures, the clinical study reports, informed consent forms. And from the classes I took recently, I have the most interest personally in the informed consent forms because they're different from the other documents in that the audience is the patients. So the language has to be very different and understandable despite the complexity of them. So of course, the efficacy or safety summaries, new drug applications, patient narratives. I also found package inserts and medication guides to be pretty interesting because, again, it brings in some of the lay language that you have to think very differently about some very complex ideas and concepts and how to break it down. I have seen advertised on LinkedIn and elsewhere that some contract research organizations offer internship to hire programs. This is a really specialized area. There aren't many programs that specifically train medical writers, for regulatory writing. It's usually something that somebody might get some professional education for, or they learn on the job. And I think the reason they do these internship to hire programs is to find the right people that work in their organization and then train them on the technicalities of the regulatory writing as they go. Medical education companies. These are some of my favorite clients. I love working in this space. I work on writing the grants to help secure funding for the educational activities. These are usually 3 to 5 page documents that are the technical portion. So we often get into writing about the mechanism of action of how a drug works, how to monitor, mitigate for adverse events. But the thing is, it's not just about regurgitating this information. It's about presenting it in a way that says, okay, we know that doctors are doing this really well, or nurses are doing this really well, but here's this gap in the care, or here's this patient population that's underserved. And this is why we need to do something differently to address these gaps or help these patients. And I really like thinking creatively about those clinical care gaps and how some of these activities can help. I've also worked on the slide decks for the faculty and expert presenters. And this is where, once it's funded, you have to then put it into a visual presentation. I like interacting with the faculty and the scientific directors on this. It's just a lot of fun to see a project get funded and then, get to see it through to the end. Writers often also help with pre and post test questions in this space, audience polling questions, for example. You might be writing marketing blurbs to help, promote that activity. And lately, I've also gotten to work with assisting with animation creation and the recording activities, which is really fun. So I enjoy adult education. This is, again, probably my favorite type of client. And there's so many other types. So academic institutions, biomedical services companies, biotech companies, all this whole list. I've worked with some of these, not all. Life science service companies can be fun because you're kind of in between them and the pharma companies that are their clients. I've worked on marketing materials for them, for example, and then academic institutions. Of course, some medical schools, are involved in clinical trials and that sort of thing. So there's space for regulatory writers there. But with my science writing background, I seem to have just always had some sort of academic affiliation where writing for colleges, writing for newsletters, for their magazines, for alumna, for example, press releases. I mean, the list goes on. There's so many opportunities. I haven't worked with physicians and hospitals, but I do know some writers who specialize in this. They might write brochures for patients or marketing materials, website copy. And then, of course, you can work directly with physicians who are authors or speakers as well. Okay, so looking for clients in regulatory writing. So here are some of the common types common client types, for this type of writing. And I've already mentioned some of these, but we're just trying to organize them into buckets here, I guess. So pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, medical device companies, the CROs that we talked about, medical schools or universities, and Medcomms agencies are all great places to start if you're interested in the freelance regulatory writing. And there's a link down here at the bottom. The American Medical Writers Association is a professional society they are the society that you want to be a part of if you're interested in freelance medical writing. And they have this guide, the ultimate guide to becoming a medical writer, that has some great resources if you're thinking about the regulatory or the medical communications path. So Medcomms clients, we already talked about agencies. The agencies can focus on a variety of things, but you can also work with authors or research investigators, biotech companies, medical book publishers. That's another good one. We talked about the med ed companies, peer-reviewed medical journals, trade journals for healthcare professionals. and other organizations as well. Patient advocacy groups, for example, are a great place to start because they might be looking for ways that they can get patient narratives out and this sort of thing, and professional healthcare societies. Um, yeah, that's the healthcare societies are a good one. So, for example, I've had a couple projects where professional societies have surveyed their membership and then they want to produce like a white paper or an article to talk about the survey results. An interesting one, I think this was like 2 years ago, is for the American College of Chest Physicians. They surveyed their members on burnout during COVID, and there was some really interesting data. So rather than do like one article for their normal magazine, they decided to do a whole white paper on it. And yeah, there's stuff like that that comes up as well. And getting to the question of how do you get into this, a lot of the work that I get, I would say about half or more is word of mouth referrals. So I think of the freelancing as like a ball of yarn. Once you start getting that ball of yarn going and you just want to keep it rolling and you keep it rolling and it just gets bigger and bigger until you've got lots of threads and opportunities going everywhere.